our 10th episode. I'd like to begin this one with a little exercise. Let's say it's the middle of the 19th century in Russia, and I'd like you to imagine what kind of a career you might pursue for yourself. Now, I acknowledge it's a little bit of a misleading exercise because by this point in time, half of Russia's population were serfs. So this hierarchy that was left over from feudalism was still growing and peaked in the middle of the 19th century in Russia under Tsarist rule. Serfs are, not very far removed from slaves. And so if you had the unfortunate circumstance to incarnate as a serf, you wouldn't even necessarily consider what you wanted to do when you grew up. The question would be irrelevant because you were working the land and working for your landlord. So Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was fortunate enough to come from a noble family, one where even just a century prior, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov for a year was fortunate enough to be in favor with Catherine the Great and was her lover for a year before he fell out of favor. So this afforded Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov with a number of privileges, but even given that, there weren't that many options for him to consider what he would do with his adult life. I mean, the men in his family had a history of serving in the Navy, so it was natural for him to become a military officer. There was one example of a composer thus far in Russia, the great Mikhail Glinka, this composer of Russian operas. But like Rimsky-Korsakov, it wasn't his profession, and like a few others that hung out with Rimsky-Korsakov, you got your group of the Great Five, the Mighty Russian Five. For these guys, music was a hobby, right? So if you're hanging out in 19th century Russia, there's going to be a lot of limitations on what you can pursue. And this is even more so the case for, back in the day, this mythological character, Scheherazade, for whom the question is she going to live or is she going to die? So Scheherazade is this great oral legend that can be traced back to ancient Persia, roots down into the Arabic Peninsula and even India. This is it's a traditional folk tale in that it has so many different sources, and that it isn't until more modern civilizations that scribes start collecting these different stories. You can have the story of Scheherazade, and from a slightly different area include the story of Aladdin and his magic lamp in there as well. So Scheherazade is this framing story. So it's the story that allows other stories to be embedded within it. Well-known stories such as Sinbad the Sailor get incorporated into the Scheherazade idea. And the idea is that you have this sultan, you have a man in power and he's wronged. So things aren't going to go well, given what his response to that is likely to be. So his wife is unfaithful to him, and he decides that if I take a different woman every night, don't marry her, don't allow her to live, then my chances of being heartbroken again are taken care of, right? So as the legend goes, he takes a different woman for 1,001 nights before he meets this young girl, essentially, Scheherazade. So Scheherazade has this great idea that if I tell the Sultan a story, but leave the story unfinished, that maybe he'll spare my life because he likes the story so much that he wants to hear how it continues the next day. And this is what ultimately goes on over and over. So in my opinion, the story of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov becoming a great composer isn't one that is fulfilled until much later on in his life. Like Scheherazade, he takes some time to get the best possible outcome of his circumstances. So he's a young adult, he's sailing all over the world, experiences that might become later realized in the music for Scheherazade. But at this point in time, he's still just composing as a hobby. Now, since he came from a noble family, he did have, piano lessons as a child, so he did have some skill then, but as I said, it's not like there's a university that he could study music at or apprentice with somebody. However, in 1861, well, a little different. 1861, there's the emancipation of the serfs in Russia. So the Tsar sees the dangers to his authoritarian rule and is like, okay, we need to make some concessions here. We need to free these people, or give the illusion that they're being given their freedom. And it's only 1 year after this that the Moscow Conservatory of Music is established, and among its first students is Peter Tchaikovsky. So for Tchaikovsky over in Moscow, his education in music was much more Germanic, and that sort of separated him apart from Rimsky-Korsakov and his buddies in the Mighty Five, who were all about having a Russian flavor, Russian folk music in their compositions, and not giving in to the Western European tradition of music making. So in addition to being a member of the Group of Five, Mily Balakirev was sort of a personal mentor for the progression of Tchaikovsky as a composer, as he's working on writing Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture for orchestra over the better part of a decade. And he's also providing his experience and guidance for Rimsky-Korsakov while Rimsky-Korsakov is still a member of the Navy. Balakirev is making sure that Rimsky-Korsakov is essentially keeping up with his homework, making sure that he's still progressing with exercises and skills and such. And eventually Rimsky-Korsakov, skipping forward a few years, is asked to lead the St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music, and this is kind of an uncomfortable position for him, because for these Group of Five composers, they essentially have turned down the idea of using a formal German education of music and using all of the sort of techniques that would identify their music as having a Western European form. How does he sort of see himself as a leader in this country and for this emerging generation of young composers? Well, ultimately, he kind of moves in his own direction, and this is a great time for him in that his compositions really start to advance and take off as he essentially administers his own self-education. So he's basically reading as much as he can and is staying, as many of us teachers would try to do, to stay one step ahead of our students, to always offer something new for them. And in the process of this, he's reading, for example, he's learning the concepts of orchestration that have been written about previously by Hector Berlioz, and eventually he becomes basically the world's foremost voice on how to write for the orchestra, how to orchestrate. So if you're a composer in the second half of the 19th century, it's impossible to not be influenced by Richard Wagner. We can't nowadays imagine a composer having the same level of influence that he would have, not just through his own art form, but on poets and authors, philosophers, leaders of state. To imagine that the King of Bavaria had a concert hall or an opera house built for him. It's like, can you imagine nowadays a composer having such influence that the King of the United States, so maybe Donald Trump, says, look, we need to build a hall for this composer. It's just not going to happen. But back in his day, that was the reach and the popularity of Wagner. Not the man's got some issues, but at least his music, everyone is forced to confront and to think about. And that's the case with Rimsky-Korsakov too, and we can see Wagner's influence at its greatest at the beginning of the music for Scheherazade, where he takes Wagner's idea of having a leitmotif, basically a miniature theme for a particular character, which enables the person who's viewing the opera or listening to the music to identify what's going on with the story according to, who's being announced by the music. Wagner's influence is certainly continuing today, and we can see this with composer John Williams having maybe a leitmotif, if you will, for someone like Darth Vader in Star Wars. So this idea of having a dramatic theme that's very distinguishing is also the case for Scheherazade. At the beginning of the music, at the beginning of Rimsky-Korsakov's music, we're introduced to the Sultan, the power, the corruption, the intimidation. It's usually performed throughout the piece by the lowest and loudest instruments. Let's hear that. Like any other great composer, anytime Rimsky-Korsakov brings back an idea, he recontextualizes it. So that particular introduction of the Sultan is the slowest iteration of his theme. And immediately thereafter, he contrasts that heavy, intimidating music with the introduction of Scheherazade. So her music is light, higher pitches, absolutely beautiful. It's usually portrayed by a solo violinist, who's right next to me there. I wish we could see her better in the video, but she did an amazing job in our performance. And as is the case with bards throughout history, these storytellers were often accompanied by a harp. So as Scheherazade starts to weave her tales, we often hear the harp along with her. One other thing about this opening movement of Scheherazade that really catches me is his grasp and manipulation of our experience of time. We know this is going to be a long piece of music. We know that Scheherazade's experience with the Sultan is going to be almost eternal, if it were. So he starts things very patiently and very gradually winds things up. So you get to these great dramatic heights, but they're arrived at very slowly. And then on top of that, you start to see the interplay between Scheherazade and the Sultan. And it's clear that she hasn't necessarily won him over yet. He's still agitated, yet nonetheless he wants to hear the conclusions of these stories. So here's an example, also from the first movement, of Scheherazade continuing her tale and the Sultan interrupting. So this amazing composition is like part program music or tone poem. It's like part operatic. And like a symphony, it has 4 different movements. So that first movement is the sea and Sinbad's ship. And like some symphonies, it sort of has this sort of overall unification and symmetry by bringing back the story of Sinbad in the fourth movement. The second movement of Rimsky-Korsakov's music, which is just only representing one of many parts of the Scheherazade story. For the second part, he selected the story of the Calendar Prince, which in the legend is a story that is being told to Sinbad. So essentially we have a story within a story within a story, this idea of the Calendar Prince. which is a little vague. There are multiple calendar characters that do appear in Scheherazade. We don't necessarily know which specific one Rimsky-Korsakov's selected. And the idea of a calendar prince itself is kind of an oxymoron, because you have the privilege of a prince, but then a calendar is basically a mystic. Maybe one of the closest things we can imagine to a spiritual incarnation in the flesh in ancient times. And such a person will have sort of sworn off materialistic temptations. So we can, and based on the Scheherazade story, we can imagine that this is somebody who is probably blind, has lost their possessions. So this is someone who has moved from being a prince to a calendar, and through various adventures has arrived perhaps at a place of greater enlightenment. This first example of music from the story of the calendar prince perhaps suggests that we're experiencing one of the mystic's misadventures as he makes this sort of personal transition or journey, and Rimsky-Korsakov gives us this experience with a very innovative sort of setting for an orchestra, in that you do have a pulse, but a pulse that is absent of any sort of metrical meter, and then you have these different entrances of solo instruments that are given almost complete freedom to do their own thing, and then like the whole band joins in together, but maybe this time it's a completely different sense of time. So there's a lot of unexpected things that are happening that are exciting for the listener and quite a challenge for us musicians. Share a more extended excerpt for the end of the music for the Calendar Prince, just to illustrate Rimsky-Korsakov's just amazing composition here. Like Hector Berlioz, who he learned himself from, in terms of how to treat the different instruments of the orchestra, you can see in this piece that he really is not just taking music that he imagined on a piano and then set, 4 instruments essentially in a way that is sort of a mapping onto the instruments, but he treats every instrument in a way that highlights the strengths of that instrument and the greatest flexibility that instrument may have. So as we sort of see this great conclusion to the second movement, you can sort of see the individual natures of each instrument being highlighted and coming to the forefront. And once again, you can see Rimsky-Korsakov's amazing sense for building drama, allowing something to this, with his sense of timing, to build to the ultimate crescendo, the ultimate acceleration, and then the ultimate finish as well. the third movement of Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, you have your basic story of boy meets girl, though in this case prince meets princess, because back in these days, royals are really the only folks who we should look up to, right? And this is an excellent musical example of Rimsky-Korsakov's pattern of sometimes using exoticism or musical orientalism in his music. And we know that this, as we've discussed in previous episodes, is a complicated issue, and we often ought to look at whether cultural appropriation has occurred. I would argue that for Rimsky-Korsakov's later and more mature compositions, that sometimes he is actually able to use this Orientalism as a way to empower the otherness or the people that we do not know. In his amazing opera that he writes later on, The Golden Cockerel, he critiques the Tsar's desire to expand the Russian Empire by having this queen of the East, and the Tsar sends off his son, and then he goes off himself to try to earn her trust or her love, and ultimately they are devoured by her for their interest in taking her and her land and her people. So this is a very controversial opera in its day, and it wasn't until the following year after Rimsky-Korsakov had died that it was able to be performed or allowed to be performed. So when Tchaikovsky would have been studying Western music at the Moscow Conservatory, we can assume that one of the first things he would have learned about were all these different types of scales that European music had been built with up to that point. And most of all of these scales are collections of pitches that are separated by either a half step or a whole step. So a half step being the smallest possible interval between notes on a piano, and a whole step being the next largest interval between notes. And regardless of how they're patterned or where these scales begin, they basically have that in common. Now for Rimsky-Korsakov, and with this particular dramatic example that you're about to hear from Scheherazade, you're going to hear a stereotype for Eastern music, which is the use of a different interval in a scale or in this particular melody, and that is the interval, the augmented second. So you hear a whole step that has been stretched further apart, so that it's 3 half steps away from the previous note. It goes something like this. Ya-da-da, ya-da-da. So with this last movement of Scheherazade, we get back to Sinbad the sailor. So he's back out on the sea again, and ultimately he looks for an even bigger conquest, and he perishes at sea, as I guess he was probably always destined to do. He's sailing on these great waves, but ultimately his ship crashes on the rocks. So Rimsky-Korsakov resorts to introducing even an additional percussion instrument to illustrate that crash at this great climax of the whole piece. But then Sinbad's story, as we know, is not the only story going on. So this sort of fades away, and at the end of the piece we can imagine we're back to Scheherazade and the Sultan, and ultimately the piece, despite all its climaxes, has a very soft, it's kind of subversive to end a symphonic piece quietly, but it has a soft and a gentle and a pleasant conclusion, because the Sultan has chosen to live the rest of his life with her as his queen. I find this piece and the story of Scheherazade and the life of Rimsky-Korsakov to be very inspiring, because Rimsky-Korsakov, came from such unlikely circumstances to become a composer, and throughout his life educated himself. It wasn't till the very end of his life that he did his best work, after humbly, digesting all of this information about music that had been written before him. And he even imparted this onto others as well. Igor Stravinsky is probably his most famous student, somebody who took Rimsky-Korsakov's great insights and skills and talents with orchestration and used that himself. So it's really this amazing piece, and what I love about Scheherazade is that you're not just in awe of the composer's talent and of his or her greatness. You're beyond that. It's a piece where you can just close your eyes and imagine this story, or imagine this experience. Maybe it's your own story. Maybe it's your own dreams, your own adventures.